We discuss today the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, I consider to be one of the philosophers of intersubjectivity. So, of course, the three others are my favorite philosophers also. Martin Buber, Gabriel Marcel, Carol Wojtyła, and Emmanuel Levinas. Sila yung the four uh, intersubjective philosophers. I consider to be intersubjective philosophers. Okay? So let's discuss about just very briefly the life and the works of Emmanuel Levinas. So he was born on January 12, 1906 in Kaunas, Lithuania. He was born of Jewish parents. And Lithuania, during the time of Levinas, was part of the pre-revolutionary Russia, the culture of which accepted the Jews. So Emmanuel Levinas, of Jewish descent, uh, the Jews during the time were accepted in Lithuania. He's the eldest child in a middle-class family, and he had two brothers, namely Boris and Aminadab. In 1914, so that's about was just about 8 years old, because of the impending war, the Levinas family emigrated to Kharkov in Ukraine. Kharkov now is very well known because it's one of the cities heavily bombarded by the Russian army. In 1920, 2 years after the country gained independence, the family returned to Lithuania, and his education enabled him to familiarize himself with the Hebrew Bible and the Russian novelists. So these are the two very important early influences in the career of Emmanuel Levinas, the Hebrew, the Jewish tradition, and Russian literature. In 1923, after studies at the gymnasiums in Kaunas and Kharkov, he went to Strasbourg to study philosophy. That's from 1924 to 1929. And Levinas studied philosophy with Maurice Pradins. He also studied psychology under Charles Blondel and sociology under Maurice Halbwachs. He also met Maurice Blanchot, who would become his actually very close friend, a very close friend of Emmanuel Levinas, Blanchot. In 1929 or 2028 to 1929, Levinas traveled to Fribourg, where he attended the last seminars given by Edmund Husserl and the lectures and seminars of Martin Heidegger. Husserl and Heidegger would be the two important philosophical influences in the philosophy and career of Emmanuel Levinas. And in 1930, he published his thesis entitled The Theory of Intuition in Husserl's Phenomenology. So one of the earliest publications of Emmanuel Levinas. In 1930, he settled in Paris, where he worked for the Alliance Israélite Universelle and its schools located throughout the Mediterranean. In 1932, he married his childhood sweetheart, Raisa Levy. They have known each other since childhood. In 1939, he was naturalized as a French citizen, and he enlisted in the French Officer Corps. 1940, he was captured by the Nazis, and he was imprisoned in the Falling Bostel, a labor camp for officers. So obviously the Nazis separated the common soldiers from the officers. His Lithuanian family was murdered. His mother-in-law was deported and never heard from again. While his father and his brothers, he had two brothers, were killed in Lithuania by the secret police, by the Gestapo, the SSS. His wife, Raisa, and his daughter, Simone, with the help of his very close friend, Maurice Blanchot, were hidden and spent the war with the nuns in the monastery in Orleans, and therefore they were spared from the Holocaust. Blanchot, at considerable personal risk, also saw to it that Levinas was able to keep in touch with his immediate family through letters and other messages. So it was Blanchot who facilitated the communication, the contact between Levinas and his family, his wife. No? Now, after the Second World War, he studied the Talmud, the scriptures, and the Jewish sacred writings, under the enigmatic Monsieur Shoshani, whose influence he acknowledged only late in his life. In 1947, he became the director of the École Normale Israélite Orientale, a training facility for teachers of those schools. And in 1961, he was appointed professor of philosophy at the University of Poitiers, and in 1967, at the University of Nanterre. In 1973, he moved to the Sorbonne, where he became an honorary professor in 1976. And Levinas died on December 25, that's Christmas Day, in 1995, very recent, weeks before his 90th birthday. So Levinas lived a rather long life. He reached his almost 90 years old. He could, January, he would have been 90 years old. The works of Levinas can be divided into three categories. First, of course, his philosophical works, composed of monographs, essays, interviews, and of course, his philosophical books. And then, his Talmudic readings and essays on Judaism. And the third category would include the posthumous notes, remarks, and texts. But the two important works or categories, classification of his works are the philosophical and the Talmudic, or sometimes there's a term for that type of writings of Levinas. I forgot the term. I forgot the word. I'll remember that later. Now, here are some of the selected major works of Levinas. Theory of Intuition in Husserl, that's based on his thesis. Modern Heidegger and Ontology, 1932. There's a backstory about this book of Levinas that he wrote on Heidegger. We'll mention that later. On Escape, 1935. Existence and Existence, 1947. Time and the Other, 1948. And then Discovering Essence or Existence with Husserl and Heidegger, and Découvrant l'existence avec Husserl et Heidegger, 1949. And then, of course, one of the more famous works of Levinas, Totality and Infinity, published in 1961. And then Difficult Freedom, Essays on Judaism, 1963. Humanism and the Other, 1972. Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence, again, another very popular book of Levinas, published in 1974. 4 lectures on Talmud, 1968. Du Sacre au Saint, 1977. L'Au-delà du Versailles, 1982. And then Ethics, again, another important work of Levinas, Ethics in Infinity, 1982. And Alterity and Transcendence, published in 1995, okay, so the year of his death. So these are just some of the many works of Emmanuel Levinas, one of the most prolific writers or philosophers we have during the contemporary era. Now, his philosophical influences, of course, the main influence of Levinas is Husserl. Added to that, of course, is Heidegger. But the first main influence of Levinas is Husserl. He actually wrote his thesis on Husserl's phenomenology, entitled The Theory of Intuition in Husserl's Phenomenology. That's the first book-length introduction to Husserl's thought in French. Now, in this work, he focused on the theme of intuition and what Husserl discussed in his book Ideas, first Ideas, Ideas 1, Ideen 1, and 2, no? Ideen 1 and 2, that every human experience is open to phenomenological description. That is, that every human experience carries meaning from the outset, and it can be examined as a mode of intentionality. Okay, so that's, again, we have already discussed Husserl, so this notion of intentionality. He also published his co-translation of Husserl's Cartesian Meditations, where Husserl laid out a systematic presentation of transcendental phenomenology. In the 1930s until World War II, most of Levinas' writings focused on introducing the phenomenology of his principal teachers, namely Husserl and then, of course, Heidegger, introducing these two German philosophers to the French audience. In the 1930s, Levinas continued to publish studies on the thought of his main teachers, Husserl and Heidegger. In fact, he published another work on Martin Heidegger and ontology, and the work of Edmund Husserl. His early commentaries on their work were collected in Discovering Existence with Husserl and Heidegger, which was later on published, no? One of the later writings of Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas was inspired by the thought of Martin Heidegger. Aside from Husserl, it was Heidegger that really inspired him. Between 1930 to 1932, Levinas planned to write a book on Heidegger. But we know what happened to Heidegger in 1933. He supported the Nazis. And this probably devastated Emmanuel Levinas. Emmanuel Levinas is a Jew, and we know that the Jews are hunted by the Nazis. So he abandoned this project in his disbelief of Heidegger's joining the Nazis. Well, a fragment of the book was published in 1932 entitled Martin Heidegger and Ontology. So if Levinas' life was dominated by the memory of the Nazi horror, we know what happened to his family under the Nazis. His family, his parents and brothers were killed. Good thing that his wife and his daughter were spared. But it dominated. So he was really deeply affected by the Nazi regime. Well, if that life was dominated by the horror of the Nazis, his philosophical life was animated by the question of how a philosopher as brilliant as Heidegger could become a Nazi sympathizer, a follower, or supporter, even if he was a supporter for a very short time. We know what happened to Heidegger. He was just dropped like a hot potato by the Nazis, no? And after that he was considered dispensable by the Nazis. So he was just dismissed by the Nazis. Okay, anyway, so Levinas' philosophical project was clearly influenced by Husserl's phenomenological method, founded on the transcendental ego. However, due to the intellectualism of Husserl's approach to essences, we know his phenomenological eidetic reduction, Levinas favored Heidegger's more experiential approach to existence, which Heidegger developed in his book Being and Time. Okay. Here, in the Being and Time, we know that Heidegger developed his idea of the Dasein. Okay. So, we know also the relationship between Husserl and Levinas. while Levinas used the phenomenological method, the approach of Husserl, but he distanced himself from the idea uh, of epoche of Husserl. Of course, we know that the main agenda of Husserl is to develop a kind of epistemology based on phenomenological method. And we can have this kind of epistemology, we can know the eidos, the essence of objects, the intentional objects of consciousness, if we perform epoche, okay, if we perform the eidetic reduction, if we perform phenomenological reduction. But according to Heidegger, we cannot do that because the Dasein is being in the world. We cannot, Dasein cannot abstract itself from the world. So while Levinas favored the method of Husserl, he favored more the experiential approach to existence of Heidegger. Okay? So he would later turn away, but he would later turn away from Heidegger's approach to being and transcendence and develop the outlines of a new ontology based on ethics as first philosophy. Because again, if we go back to Heidegger, we know that Heidegger's main main objective is to develop a kind of fundamental ontology, right? A hermeneutical ontology, a fundamental ontology, where he will, where he discussed the meaning of being. Okay, so the main interest, the main project of Heidegger is to develop an ontology, philosophy of being. But Levinas has a different objective. We want to develop a kind of philosophy where ethics is considered to be the first philosophy. So it's not ontology, it's not metaphysics, but ethics is the first philosophy. And if we go back to Aristotle, for Aristotle, metaphysics is first philosophy, right? But according to Levinas, the first philosophy is ethics. And we have to understand what he meant by ethics here. No? It's not the ethics that we study about norms, about values. No, it's not like that. No? So it's a different kind of interpretation of ethics. We'll discuss that later. So he wrote a philosophical critique about Heidegger's assessment of ethics, playing a secondary role in Heidegger's phenomenology. No, because, of course, for Heidegger, the first is ontology, fundamental ontology, and ethics is just a secondary, just plays a secondary role. But according to Levinas, that's not the case. The first philosophy must be ethics. So this is a critique that he eventually expanded to Western philosophical tradition as a whole. So first, Levinas was critical of Heidegger's assessment of ethics, and then later on, Levinas expanded that criticism to the whole Western philosophical tradition. Levinas would argue that ethics must be reinterpreted and understood as first philosophy, meaning it must be the metaphysics. Because Aristotle calls metaphysics the first philosophy, but it should not be ontology. The first metaphysics, the first philosophy should be ethics, according to Levinas. No? And that ethics is not a derivative extension based on premises coming from the ontological or epistemological or political narratives. So it has to be, ethics must be interpreted, must be understood as first philosophy. Now, in his first personal essay on escape, De l'Évasion in 1935, Levinas tackles the question whether it is possible to evade the totalizing tendency of being. So this is the first, this is where he first tackled the question about totality, the totalizing tendency of being. Okay, which later on he will say that that totalizing is actually a kind of violence, no? The totalizing tendency of being. His answer for this question coincided with the beginning of his criticism of Heidegger's ontology. In his first personal book, which bears the anti-Hegelian title, The Existence, no? From Existence to Existence, or From Being to Beings. No? From being to beings. The uh, why display of from being to beings, from existence to existence? Because if you remember our discussion on Heidegger, although Heidegger was talking about the sciences, right? Sciences would be the entities, okay, the beings, the small b, and one of these sciences that have consciousness is the Dasein, okay. But the real objective of Heidegger is to understand what is being. But before we can understand what is being, that to be, we have to understand first the sciences. So before we can understand the sign, we have to understand the sciences. We have to understand the beings. And then, if we understand the beings, and the one entity that can understand being is the Dasein, the inquirer, then we can understand being, no, the capital B, the sign. No? That's why title is Being and Time, Being. But uh, Levinas sort of twisted this idea of Heidegger and said it's from being to beings. Okay, so baliktad, not from beings to being, but from being to beings. Okay, anyway, so I hope you get the point there. Now, let's discuss now Levinas' general philosophical ideas. So, isa-isa natin ito. First, how he interpreted phenomenology, how he used phenomenology, of course, from Husserl, meaning of being, and other. As a phenomenologist, Levinas is faithful, of course, to the spirit of Husserl, especially to the method of Husserl of intentional analysis. Okay, so remember the concept of intentionality of Husserl. Okay, consciousness is always consciousness of something. Consciousness has its intentional objects, intentional analysis. So for him, intentional analysis is the search for the concrete. That's Levinas. Notions held under the direct analysis of the thought that defines them are nevertheless unknown to this naive thought and revealed to be implanted in horizons unsuspected by this thought. And these horizons endow them with meaning. Such is the essential teaching of Husserl. That's how Levinas understands the phenomenology of Husserl. Okay? So search for the concrete. Now, intentional analysis begins from the unreflective naivete of the natural attitude. Again, it's just going back to what we discussed in Husserl, okay? The natural attitude. Through the operation of the phenomenological reduction, this is now the phenomenological method, it seeks to describe the deep structures of intentional life. Okay? Describe the deep structures of intentional life, structures which give meaning to that life, but which are forgotten in that naivete. In other words, well, the natural attitude would be the day-to-day, no, the experience, no? Intuition, our personal experiences. Okay? So from our experiences, we through the phenomenological method, we try to describe, okay, the very foundation of our life. No? what gives meaning to our life. So in phenomenology, this is the concrete, okay? Not the empirical givens of sense data. Uh, Sometimes you call this the phenomenological facts. Okay? So the concrete is not the sense data, but the meaning that we get from our experiences. Okay, so this is the concrete, but the a priori structures that give meaning to those seeming givens. So as Levinas puts it, what counts is the idea of the overflowing of objectifying thought by a forgotten experience from which it lives. The forgotten experience would be the naive natural attitude. Philosophy is the work of reflection that is brought to bear on unreflective everyday life. Now, the unreflective everyday life, the naive, the natural attitude, no? uh, unreflective. No? But we need to focus on these experiences, and by way of phenomenology, we get the basic structures, the meaning, the eidos, so to speak, the eidos. Also, the eidos would be the the basic facts of human existence, not the material, not the material things. So, if the fundamental action of phenomenology is the intentionality of thought that is being directed towards its various matters, the intentional objects, then Levinas' ethical relation to the other person is not phenomenological, because the other is not given as a matter for thought or reflection. Yes, the physical objects are given to us, given to our consciousness. They become the objects of our consciousness. However, the other person, the other, is not phenomenological. It's not an object that, uh, it's not like, say, this laptop in front of me. I can perform the phenomenological method. I can direct my intention to this object and get the eidos, uh, the essence of this object. But the other person is not like any other object. Okay, because the other, according to Levinas, is not given as a matter for reflection or for thought. Well, we can think of the different objects, but the other does not fall into that category. So according to Levinas, the other person, is not a phenomenon. And it's not like any objects that we perceive. It's not a phenomenon. Okay? If it is a phenomenon, then we can perform the phenomenological method in order to understand them, to know their meaning, to know their essence. But the other is not a phenomenon. According to Levinas, the other is an enigma. Okay? An enigma, something ultimately refractory to intentionality, and it is opaque to the understanding. We cannot rationalize, we cannot comprehend, we cannot understand the other the way we understand objects, the way we understand physical objects, the way we understand phenomena. So we can see here that Levinas commits not to the substance, but to the method of Husserlian phenomenology. So similar to the other students of Husserl, Levinas used the method of Husserl, but set aside the very substance of his philosophy. It's like Heidegger, he used the phenomenology of Husserl, but applied phenomenology to the Dasein. Max Scheler used the phenomenology of Husserl, but applied it to axiology. Levinas used the phenomenology, the method of Husserl, applied it to what he calls ethics, the first philosophy. Okay. So Heidegger's fundamental ontology raised anew the question of the meaning of being through the analysis of that being for whom being is an issue. Remember the Dasein. Okay? So the Dasein is a being, but an entity, a scientist. But it's different from the other scientists. It's different from the other entities because, one, the Dasein has consciousness. It can understand its own being, and it can also understand the being of other beings, of the other entities. Okay? But remember that for Heidegger, the focus is on the question on the meaning of being. So although he discussed Dasein, because the Dasein is the inquirer, but the ultimate purpose, the ultimate objective of Heidegger is not just to discuss about the Dasein, but to understand the meaning of being. You go back to the preface of the Being in Time. That's he set out there his intention, his philosophical, his objective in his philosophy, right? To raise the question about the meaning of being. So what Heidegger seeks to do in the Being in Time, in the spirit of a certain intention analysis, is to identify the basic or a priori structures of the Dasein. Because by identifying the basic structures, the existentialia, we discussed that in Heidegger, the existentiality, Verfälllichkeit, Verstehen, Verfallen, then he will understand the meaning of being. Okay? So, these existentials would give Heidegger the view about the meaning of being. Okay? Now, for Levinas, the basic advance and advantage of Heideggerian ontology over Husserl's phenomenology is that it begins from an analysis of the factual situation of the human being, of the Daseins in everyday life, what Heidegger calls facticity. So this is where we distinguish the phenomenology of Husserl, which is too speculative, too intellectual, according to Levinas, from the phenomenology of Husserl or Heidegger from his ontology, where he started his analysis from the human experiences, from the factual situation of the Dasein. Okay, so for Levinas, Heidegger's approach is experiential. So Heidegger's investigation in the meaning of being to be intelligible does not presuppose a merely intellectual attitude, unlike Husserl, but rather the rich variety of intentional life, the emotional and the practical as well as theoretical, through which we relate to things, persons, and the world. So the essential contribution of Heideggerian ontology is its critique of intellectualism that we can see in Husserl. Ontology is not a theoretical endeavor, but is grounded in the existential engagement of the Dasein, or the human being in the world, which is a prerequisite for the analysis of being. So again, if we go back to Heidegger, Heidegger said, before we can ask the question of the meaning of being, we have to ask first the question about the inquirer, the Dasein. So in his analysis of the Dasein, started from the Dasein's engagement in the world, from the Dasein's facticity. All right, so that's Heidegger. However, Levinas claims that contrary to Heidegger, that Dasein's understanding of being presupposes an ethical relation with the other human being. It presupposes relation with the other Daseins. Okay. Well, in fairness to Heidegger, Heidegger also talked about Mitsein, right, with other Dasein. that the Dasein is not just being in the world, it's also a being, there is also a being there too. But for Heidegger, this is just secondary. The main project is to really develop the or analyze the a priori structures of the Dasein, not his ethical relation with the other. So this is where Levinas criticized Heidegger. Okay, that the Dasein's understanding of being presupposes, in fact, it's based on his ethical relation with other being. So that is, for Levinas, that's primary. That is prior to any uh, understanding of being, of any of the being of beings, right? So that being to whom I speak, the other, that's the other human being, and to whom I am obliged before being comprehended. So that's very important for Levinas. Yes, we may attempt to comprehend, understand this being, but before we can understand this other human being, the other, okay, we have to establish an ethical relationship first with him. And therefore, according to Levinas, fundamental ontology is fundamentally ethical. Okay? So he tried he diverted from the fundamental ontology of Heidegger. Because the fundamental ontology of Heidegger is to analyze the meaning of being. Right? This being here of Heidegger is not the entities, that's different, right? Huh? The potentiality of these beings. But he said, for Levinas, no. The basis of that ontology is ethics. The ethical relation with other human beings. Right? So that's why for Levinas, first philosophy is ethics. By ethics, he means ethical relation. So the central task is to describe a relation irreducible to comprehension, understanding. Ontology is Levinas' general term for any relation to otherness that is reducible to comprehension or understanding. Okay? Ontology is the attempt to understand, to comprehend anything. Okay? Anything. All right, so Husserl's phenomenology is therefore ontological because the intentionality thesis assumes a correlation between the intentional act and the object of that intention. However, how can a relation with a being be other than comprehension? Because of course, uh, Husserl and even Heidegger would assume that the relation with another being is always based on comprehension, based on understanding. Okay? Levinas' response to it is that it cannot unless it is the other. Meaning, yes, we can have a comprehension with a being. However, if that being is the other, then we cannot apply comprehension. Okay? We cannot apply comprehension here. The relation with the other goes beyond comprehension. With that, it does not affect us in terms of a theme or a concept, because the other is not supposed to be conceptualized. The other is not supposed to be reduced to a concept. Okay? We don't reduce the other to a concept. Because according to Levinas, if the other is reducible to the concept, then that would make the relation to the other a relation of knowledge or simply an epistemological feature. That is exactly what Husserl did in his phenomenology. To know, to understand, to establish a relation of knowledge with the other. But according to Levinas, the other is different. The other is not a phenomenon. Okay? And therefore, we cannot we cannot establish a relation of comprehension or a relation of knowledge. Okay? If you go back to Husserl, no? Ang project ng Husserl, 'di ba? Sabi natin, epistemology ito. So Husserl wanted to know the essence of things, the essence of reality. That's why we do phenomenological method. Okay? Ang naging project ni Husserl is that hindi siya nag-distinguish. Although, makikita natin na meron din distinction between a human being and another being. Kasi being lang ang pinag-uusapan, di ba? Being. So, kung ang ating intention is to understand being, whether that being is a physical object, material being, or a human being, understanding would always be based on what concept we have of a person or of a thing. Diba? So, alam mo, ano bang idea natin pagka sinabi natin kakamping? O, ano bang idea natin pag sinabi natin BBM? O halimbawa, troll. Diba? Pero itong troll, BBM, kakamping, mga tao ito. So sabi ni Levinas, pwede tayong magkaroon ng idea, ng theme, ng understanding, ng comprehension ng mga physical beings. Okay? We can establish a relation of knowledge, of comprehension. Kasi phenomenon sila. But the other is not the other person, the person. Hindi siya bagay. Hindi siya phenomenon. Okay? So, hindi tayo pwede pwede mo rin sabihin, pwede kang magkaroon ng idea kung sino yon. But according to Levinas, yes, sabihin natin, okay, magkakaroon ako ng idea kung sino ito. Pero, hindi yan yung primary. Ang primary relation natin sa iba ay kausapin siya, makirelate sa kanya, di ba? You talk to him. So, yun yung tinatawag niyang ethical relation. Yun ang basihan ng ontology. So, pagka ang tinutukoy natin ay tao, hindi tayo pwedeng magkaroon ng hindi tayo pwedeng nandun lang sa idea, sa concept kung ano yung tao. Kasi yung tao, para kay Levinas, yung other, hindi siya phenomenon. Hindi siya intentional object. No? Yun ang pinaka basic na konsepto ni Levinas pagdating doon sa other.
Pwede naman natin kasi sabihin na lahat ng bagay na na-encounter natin, whether tao yan o material na bagay, nagkakaroon tayo ng idea kung ano yan o sino sila, di ba? Pero para kay Levinas kasi, iba yung tao, yung other, sa mga bagay. Yung physical objects, di ba? Tingnan mo yung laptop mo, pwede ka magkaroon ng idea kung ano yung laptop. Yung phone, mga phenomenon yan eh. Actually, pwede mong i-perform dyan yung phenomenological method, yung eidetic reduction, yung bracketing, di ba? Pero sabi ni Levinas, hindi yan uobra pag sa tao. Kasi yung tao, hindi object. Siguro, secondary, pwede mong magkaroon, bakit nagkakaroon ka ng idea kung sino yung kaibigan mo? O sige, tanggapin natin. Pero sabi ni Levinas, sabihin natin posible yan. Pero ang pinagbabatayan yan, yung pinaka-primary dyan ay yung relationship natin sa tao. Nakausap mo muna siya. Diba? Nakikipagkwentuhan ka, nakikipagkaibigan ka, o pwede nga makipag-away ka pa dun sa mga trolls. Nagkaroon ka ng idea kung ano yung troll. Pero yung idea mo rin ng troll nakabase yun, nakasala yun sa ugnayan, sa relationship. At para kay Levinas, yung relationship na yun ay nandun sa domain ng ethics, hindi ng ontology. Kaya sinabi niya yung first philosophy dapat hindi ontology, kundi ethics. Okay?
Titingnan natin sa experience, pwede natin sabihin na si Levinas at si Heidegger ay pareho dahil nagmumula sila sa karanasan, sa experience, no? Ang ano lang doon, kay Heidegger, ginamit niya yung experiential o yung sa lengguwahe ni Heidegger, yung facticity, diba? Kasi yung factual situation na, no? Pero ginamit niya yung factual situation, facticity na yon nung Dasein para palabasin o para sa kanyang analysis ng meaning ng being. So yung endpoint ni Heidegger, yung ontology pa rin. What is the meaning of being? Kasi, di ba, si Heidegger mismo nagsabi, hindi ako existentialist. Kasi akala ng marami existentialist si Heidegger kasi puro dasein ang kanyang diniscuss doon sa kanyang being and time. Pero yung being and time ni Heidegger ay preliminary pa lang. Di ba? Kasi ang kanyang pinaka-main purpose is to explicate the meaning of being. So, fundamental ontology ang project ni Heidegger. So, para kay Heidegger, ang first philosophy talaga, ontology. Although, nagmula siya doon sa experience. So, sabi ni Levinas, tama naman yan, experience. Pero, ang patutunguhan nito, hindi dapat ontology. Ang patutunguhan nito ay ethics. Maipakita na yung first philosophy na tinatawag natin ay hindi ontology, kundi ethics. Kasi doon nakasalalay doon sa relationship ng tao sa kapwa niya, yung mga eventually yung mga malalaman niya sa mundo. So yung ethics is the first philosophy. Huwag niyo isipin yung ethics na parang yung ethics na inaaral natin, no? May mga norms, may mga virtues, standards of morality. Hindi yun ang ethics na tinutukoy ni Levinas. Kundi yung relationship ng tao sa kapwa. Yung tinatawag niyang other. Mamaya, di-develop niya yung the face of the other. Kasi nga naman, ano bang other yan? Baka napaka-abstract naman yung other na yan. Puro lang other, pero hindi mo naman nakikita pala yung other. Sabi ni Levinas, hindi. May mukha yan. May mukha yung other. Right? While Heidegger maintains the gift of being is gift, Levinas takes up Blanchot's Ilia. There is. There is. And the question that initiates fundamental ontology is, why is there being instead of nothing? Okay? Why is there being instead of nothing? And sagot dyan ni Heidegger is, there is already being. Okay? There is already being. And Levinas is not so much concerned about being, unlike Heidegger, nor with nothingness. No? Kasi kay Heidegger, talagang ano yan, central focus yan sa philosophy ni Heidegger. Yung concept ng being. But Levinas does not problematize this. He does not problematize being and nothingness. Nothingness may be understood as pure absence, but it cannot be experienced. But there is always something that remains. There is always something that remains. Therefore, an indeterminate nocturnal being remains something. There is. There is. So, you can ask, why is there being instead of nothing? So you focus on what is nothing, but nothing cannot be experienced. What we experience is that there's always something that remains, the Ilia. And this Ilia fills in all spatial and temporal intervals, meaning the interval between the gap between nothing and being, becoming. There's always that remains. There is always. So the Ilia is indetermination. There's always something, even in what seems to be nothing. So Levinas does not problematize whether it is being or nothing. Because even in those things that seem to be nothing, there is something that remains. So the Ilya is the impersonality and persistence of being. The persistence of being. Therefore, the Ilya is omnipresence. Omnipresence because it's always present. There's always something. Okay? It is a presence that is simply there but cannot be named or identified. You know, those of you who are, meron bang Bicolano dito sa klase natin? May ano kung merong Bicolano sa klase? Raise your hand. Wala? Walang from Bicol? Sayang, gagamitin ko pa naman sana yun. Sa Bicol kasi
Si
meron.
Ange daw po, Dok.
Sino?
Si Ange daw po.
Sa mom side lang po yun, Dok.
Pero nakakaintindi ka ng Bicol?
Onti lang po. As in, onti lang.
Wala makaka-relate sa ano. Sa Bicol kasi merong yaon. Yaon. Ang yaon, ibig sabihin ng yaon, nandyan. Yaon dyan, nandyan. Parang yung, ang equivalent niyan ay meron. Kilala niyo naman si Father Feriol, no? Father Feriols? Oh, meron.
Kilala po, Dok.
Ayan. So yung Ilya, there is similar doon sa yaon. Sa Tagalog, ano bang pwedeng ano niya? Hindi naman kasi meron, although ginamit ni Father Roque yan. Yung meron, pero yung meron, iba yung kahulugan ng nandyan eh. Nandyan. Yaon dyan. Yaon ka dyan, nandyan ka ba? Nandyan sa bahay, yaon sa harong, yaon duman, yaon digdi, yaon. But, ibig sabihin, there is always something that remains. No? Pwede mo sabihin, pero minsan ang yaon dyan, lagi siyang naandyan. So kahit nasabihin natin parang wala, pero nandyan pa rin. There's something that remains. Yan yung concept ng nung Ilya. No? Okay, alright. So, the Ilya is only presence. It is a presence that is simply there but cannot be named or identified. The subject becomes a subject in virtue of its emergence from the Ilya. Okay? There's always the subject. The subject draws out itself from the Ilya. And the subject is that which separates itself from the anonymity of the Ilya. Kumbaga, paganahan niyo yung yung utak, yung imagination niyo. So, meron dyan. Nandyan palagi. Ano ba? Paano ba pwedeng to? Laging merong tutulong sa'yo. Sa pangangailangan mo, laging merong tutulong sa'yo. Sino yan? From that, di mo alam kung sino. Anonymous kung sino yung tutulong sa'yo. And then somebody emerges at tumulong sa'yo. That is the subject emerging from the Ilya. So sabihin natin, hindi naman talaga kawalan kasi lagi merong tutulong. Tapos merong susulpot dyan na tutulong sa'yo. No? So kahit sa kadiliman, halimbawa ng gabi, at sa tingin mo walang tutulong sa'yo, merong laging dadating na tulong. At lalabas yung subject, mag-emerge from that anonymity. Tutulong siya sa'yo. At yung taong tumulong na sa'yo, yun yung subject that separates itself from the anonymity of kung sino yung tutulong. Di ba? Parang sa pag-ibig, lagi merong magmamahal sa'yo. And then eventually somebody emerges at minahal ka. Diba? Oh. Laging merong taong magbibigay ng pag-asa. Sino yun? Anonymous. Pero there is Ilya. And then suddenly, lumabas Leni Robredo. Pero pagkatapos ng eleksyon, dinaya. Oh. Di ba? But the point is, there is Ilya, and then out of the Ilya emerges the subject. Okay? Now, let's go now to this line, which is, we attribute to Levinas. Ethics as first philosophy. Nga ba yun? Bakit sinabi niya? Why did he say ethics is the first philosophy? Well, we have already touched this, but let's go deeper into this. Levinas was inspired by Plato. And through Plato, Levinas contended that the question of the good has priority over that of being. Okay? It's priority over that of being because interhuman rationality precedes any discourse or logos about being. Okay? And if you go back to Plato, bakit yung good has priority over being? Kasi para kay Plato, imagine nyo remember the allegory of the caves. Alright? Somebody from the caves was able to escape, right? And went out of the cave. And then he realized that the shadows that they see projected on the walls of the cave are merely images. They're just shadows. And when he went out of the cave, he realized this is reality. These are not shadows. These are not real objects. And what allows the person to see reality is the sun, right? And Plato equates the sun with the good. So for Plato, the good is the highest of the ideas, right? The good is the highest of the innate ideas. Now, Levinas used the same idea. No? He said, human relationality precedes any discourse or logos about beings, whether that being is human or physical or non-human. Okay? So, doon nag-uumpisa yung konsepto ni Levinas. Human relationality or human relations is prior to any discourse, to any logos. However, his ethics should not be interpreted, as I've said, in the traditional sense. So it's not the kind of ethics that prescribes certain norms or standards. Of course, he does not deny the importance of the faculties of practical reasoning. But his ethics is not based on this concept of ethics that, talks about virtues, reason, utility, or whatever. Ethics for Levinas refers to the fact that the I cannot refuse responsibility for the other. Since the act of disregarding or refusing responsibility is possible only on the basis of my being always already capable of responding to the other who imposes responsibility on me. In other words, by ethics, Levinas means the subject's responsibility for the other. And that responsibility for the other is, of course, based on ethical relation. We cannot, he said, we cannot disregard, we cannot refuse this responsibility. Why? Because the possibility of this is based on the possibility of disregarding or ignoring is based on our capability to respond to the other. The other imposes a responsibility on the self. Okay? And for Levinas, that is primordial. It precedes any kind of discourse. That is the first discourse. The eyes or the subject's responsibility for the other. So, well, we can recognize the other discourses like ontology, epistemology, politics. But all of these other discourses are secondary, because they make sense only because of our ability to respond to the other who makes a command that I cannot efface, a command that I cannot ignore, even when I try to ignore it, because this other imposes a responsibility on the self. And therefore, Levinas said this is the first philosophy. So Levinas' one big idea is expressed in his thesis that ethics is first philosophy, where ethics is understood as a relation of infinite responsibility of the self to the other person. And the central task of Levinas' works, in his words, is the attempt to describe a relation with the other person that cannot be reduced to comprehension or understanding. A relation with the other that cannot be reduced to mere understanding. Because this other is not a phenomenon. This other is a human person. He is not a non-being, a non-human. He is a human being. And Levinas finds this in what he calls the face-to-face relation. Okay. Now, let's go to the next point. And we'll try to connect this to the previous points that we have discussed, totality and infinity. In the totality and infinity, Levinas critiqued the entire Western philosophy. First, he started with Heidegger's ontology, but he extended his critique to the entire Western tradition, Western philosophical tradition. And he showed why philosophy has not been faithful to the most important facts of human existence and how its basic perspective should be replaced by another one. Now, what does he mean by totality? By totality, Levinas meant the absolutization of a universal perspective. Absolutization of a universal perspective, from which reality is understood as an all-encompassing universe. So when you say totality, it's absolutizing a universal perspective. And from this absolute universal perspective, we try to understand reality as all-encompassing. Okay? So to totalize is to make absolute a universal perspective. Okay? So what happens now? If there is totality, then all kinds of relation, all kinds of separation or exteriority or alterity are reduced to internal moments of one totality. One totality. Now, the relative truth of the ego's autonomy is shown in a phenomenology of the way in which human beings inhabit the world like a house or an economy or a home. So here, this is similar to Heidegger's concept of world. No, that the Dasein is thrown into the world, right? We mentioned about the worldhood of the world. The Dasein is thrown into the world, and of course, Heidegger distinguished several meanings of the world, but the world that is closest to us would be our environment. Like for example, um, if you are a priest, part of that world would be the different equipments, the different tools that you use to minister, okay, or to perform the sacrament. So the host, the chalice, the vestments would be part of that home, okay? So that would be the economy, right? So the economy is the whole system by which all the self, the Dasein in the case of Heidegger, the self maintains itself, or the Dasein maintains itself. So the environment, the Umwelt. Now, Levinas characterizes this economy or house as vitality or enjoyment, the enjoyment of the elements. Now, let's go back to Heidegger. For Heidegger, this home, he would characterize his home or this Umwelt as comprising of the different objects, the different tools that the Dasein use. So these different tools, these different equipments are go hand in hand, ready at hand, or presence at hand. Okay? So for example, you have your laptop, you have your ball pen, you have your cell phone, whatever. So that would be part of your world. Okay? And according to Heidegger, our primary relation with the world is to use it. Meaning to use these objects as tools. Okay? As equipments. That's actually the critique of Heidegger against Husserl. Because Husserl said, our primary orientation with the world is to know the world, no? Through the phenomenological method, bracketing, etc., etc. But according to Heidegger, no. Before we can understand the meaning, for example, of a hammer, we use the hammer. Before we can understand the meaning of a doorknob, we use the doorknob. So using handling tools is our primordial commerce or orientation with the world. But Levinas contradicted Heidegger here. So indirectly, he dismissed Heidegger's contention about handling of tools. Because Levinas focused on the dimension of human eating, drinking, walking, dwelling, laboring. He said these dimensions of enjoyment, of vitality, are more primordial than the handling of tools. And they are much closer to the natural elements than scientific or technological objectification, which Heidegger referred to in his ontology. Okay? So, let's go to the concept of infinity. So, this is where we connect infinity and totality. Infinity is contrasted with totality. If totality is totalizing or absolutizing everything, no? Universalizing everything, infinity is different. And infinity is another term for the other. Okay? But in what sense does infinity apply to the other? Infinity is, or the other is infinity, vice versa, because the other does not fit into that totality. In other words, yes, maybe you can have the totality of things, of physical objects, right? You can say, well, these things are beings, and as beings, they are so and so. Okay? You can conceptualize, you can define, okay? You can understand. But since the other is not a phenomenon, not an object, he does not fit into that totality. Okay? So, infinity is the other, insofar as the other does not fit into that totality. What could fit in the totality? Well, the other things, the other phenomena, but not the enigma. Okay? Of course, there's always the attempt to totalize the other, to make the other fit into our own conception, into our own understanding. We try to put in a box the other. We try to totalize the other, absolutize the other. The other should be this, that. Try to define the other. But again, the other is not like that. Now, Levinas discovered this relation between totality and the infinite through Descartes' meditations. We know that in the meditation, Descartes asserts the idea of an infinite God, an infinite being. And according to Descartes, this idea of God as infinite cannot be reduced from any other idea. So, this idea of God cannot be reduced, cannot fit into any idea of a being. Because this idea of God as the infinite surpasses the capacity of the mind. It surpasses the capacity of our consciousness. So it is a thought that is more than thought. It is beyond what we can think. It is an idea beyond any other idea. It thinks more than it can think. Descartes said, this is the idea of God is an idea that is beyond me. This is not my product. I did not conceive this idea of God. This idea of God must have come from something. That idea of God must have come from a God who put that idea into my mind, into my consciousness. So Descartes describes this relation between the mind, the ego, the consciousness, and the infinite, this infinite idea, as one of transcendence. So the infinite here remains exterior to consciousness. Yes, God put that idea in my head, in my mind, but that God, that infinite, is outside of me, exterior to my consciousness. However, while the infinite can be referred to as God, as in the case of Descartes, what interests Levinas is the relation between the subject, or the ego, or the consciousness, and the infinite. So in Descartes' meditation provided Levinas with the notion that the human subject has an idea of infinity. Has an idea, for Descartes, that idea of infinity refers to God. Right? But for Levinas, that idea of infinity is the other. So this idea, by definition, is thought that contains more than can be thought. It cannot be reduced simply as an idea. That's why the other cannot be reduced simply as an idea, because it is something that is infinite. It is something that is beyond thought. It cannot be reduced to idea, to a theme, to a concept. And therefore, the relation of the res cogitans to God through the idea of the infinite provides Levinas with a picture or a formal model of a relation between two terms that is based on height, based on equality, based on non-reciprocity, based on asymmetry. The ego, the self, we can say is finite, but the other is infinite. It is beyond, it transcends our consciousness. Therefore, there is always that relation between the self and the other is always based on height. The other is always on a higher level, on a higher plane than the subject, than the self. It is an asymmetrical relation. Now, the next task is to locate the concrete content for this formal structure or formal model of relation. And for Levinas, the social expression of this formal structure or model is the ethical relation to the face of the other person. That's why I said a while ago that the other is not just a faceless other. There is the face of the other. And Levinas writes, the idea of infinity is the social relationship. He says, the way in which the other presents himself exceeding the idea of the other in me, we here name face, la visage. So the concrete sense of the formal structure thus indicated is shown through a phenomenology of the human other, whose epiphany, the revelation, reveals an absolute command. Again, this is now the ethical responsibility, the command. But as soon as I am confronted by the face of the other, I discover myself to be under an absolute obligation. The fact of the other's existence immediately reveals to me the basic ought of all ethics. The basic ought of all ethics. What is the basic? What is the fundament? This absolute obligation. It commands that we have to take care of the other. There is an absolute responsibility for the other. Thus, on this level, is and ought are inseparable. I see the other, there is the other, and I ought to help the other, to be responsible for the other. Levinas often uses the expression the face or the speech to indicate that the fact that the other is looking at me, speaking to me, are the most striking expressions of the other's infinity or height. Remember, infinity, beyond, transcends, height, superior, asymmetrical. The intersubjective relation between the subject and the infinite is asymmetrical, meaning the other appears primarily not as an equal or equal to me, but rather as higher, commanding me. I am responsible for the other's life. A responsibility that puts infinite demands on me, absolute obligation. But I cannot order another to give his or her life for me. So it's actually a one-sided relation. This intersubjective relationship between the subject and the other is described as non-chosen responsibility, because something that is just forced on you. No? It's or substitution. No? The subjectivity is determined as non-chosen being for others. Subjectivity is primarily sensibility, being touched and affected by the other. It is a vulnerability. Okay, so let's discuss the face of the other. Levinas has endeavored to show that the other, that is the human person, the human other person, is radically different from all other beings in the world. Okay? So as we've said, that the human person, the other, is not just any other being. It's not just any other entity. Well, in this sense, Levinas shares the same position as Heidegger, because Heidegger also mentioned that the human person, the Dasein, is different from the other entities. So according to Levinas, the human person is not a phenomenon similar to the other entities in the world. The other's prominence cannot be regarded as a category of the general way in which other beings appear to us. The other beings can be conceptualized. We can understand. We can perform the phenomenology. We can apply phenomenology to these other beings. But the other is not perceived as one that can be absorbed into our understanding or consciousness, just like the other beings that are phenomenal. No? I hope, Alex, naiintindi mo na ito ngayon, ano? Yung paliwanag ko kanina. Okay? So, for this reason, Levinas reserves the word phenomenon for realities that fit into the totality of things or beings ruled by the self-understanding. So the phenomenon, the other realities, they can fit in the totality of beings, but the other as infinity cannot fit into that totality. No? Since the other becomes a moment of such, since the other cannot become a moment of such totality, it is not a phenomenon, but rather an enigma, not to be defined in phenomenological terms. So the other is not present to me in the same sense in which I am present to myself. Indeed, he or she is given precisely as a face, or as Levinas also puts it, a trace, which is not a phenomenon, but rather an enigmatic epiphany of the infinite ethical demand of the other. The other remains, therefore, always a separate being. So we cannot absorb really the other because it's always different, unique, separate from us, whose transcendence prevents me from establishing a direct relationship with him or her. Because that relationship is always asymmetrical. It's always on a height. So departing from the common understanding of moral consciousness as consciousness of values, Levinas considers moral consciousness as that where we gain an access to exterior being. The other. The exterior being is what Levinas calls la visage, the face, that exterior being, which is the way in which the other presents himself, exceeding the idea of the other in me. Again, remember the infinity. No? Thought that is more than thought, exceeding the idea of the other in me. Levinas writes, the face is present in its refusal to be contained, meaning the refusal of the other to be conceptualized, to be comprehended. In the sense, it cannot be comprehended, that is encompassed. It is neither seen nor touched, for in visual or tactile sensation, the identity of the eye envelopes the alterity of the object, which becomes precisely a content. It is through the face that the other manifests herself or himself before me, and it goes beyond my ability to evaluate, to comprehend, and to thematize him or her. It is precisely because the face cannot be comprehended and thematized that the face signifies transcendence. It is beyond, it exceeds thought that is more than thought. So what Levinas means by face is beyond the physical form of it, of course. One cannot see and touch the face, he says, precisely because it is present in its refusal to be contained. Hence, the real encounter with the other can only take place beyond the physical appearance of the face that we come across every day. Levinas explains that the best way to encounter the other is not even to notice the color of his eyes or to focus on his physical appearance or physical features. When one observes the color of the eyes, one is not in social relationship with the other. The relation with the face can surely be dominated by perception, but what is specifically the face is what cannot be reduced to that. It's similar to what Buber said, that if we focus on the physical appearance of the other, then the other ceases to be a thou. The other becomes an it. So, phenomenology cannot fully express the proper meaning of the face. The face is the very collapse of phenomenality. Because phenomenon is applicable, or the phenomenon is, or phenomenology is applicable only to physical objects, not to the other, not to the face. Further, Levinas elaborates that the signification of the face cannot be gleaned through vision, which is a search for adequation. And vision is what par excellence absorbs being. So we cannot see the face through vision, because he said vision absorbs being. It totalizes. It is this absorption of being that leads to totalization, which cannot, of course, be ethical, because the totalization is against the ethical. The ethical is the relationship of absolute responsibility for the other. The other as infinity cannot fit into the totality of things. This is the reason why the encounter with the face cannot take place at the level of pure perception. He writes, meeting the face is not of the order of pure and simple perception, of intentionality, which goes toward adequation. The face is signification without context. It is meaning all by itself. So it's really the face, our relationship with the other is something that is a thing of its own. Right? While we often encounter a person through a particular context, and through this context, he becomes intelligible to us. For example, your professor will only make sense in the context of academics, or a priest will only make sense in the context of the religious life. Faith, on the contrary, is never within a particular context or relative to it. In other words, we don't contextualize, we don't compartmentalize, we don't define the other. But for example, I'm going to be responsible for this because this person is a camping, or that this person is a student of mine. No, the other, we are responsible for the other precisely because he's a human being. So it is meaningful in and of itself. The face is beyond the description of phenomenology because it is not seen. It is not perceived. The face always resists the absorption of thought to become its content. For Levinas, the relation to the face is immediately ethical. So we often treat the other person based on our own idea of the other, which often is based on abstraction. No, even before we have encountered or met the other, we already have a preconception of the other. So we try to fit the other into that perception, even if we have not seen him. Okay? Intersubjective relation, in the sense, occurs through mediation, through our thinking of the other. There is already the thought, our thought of the other, and we try to fit the other into that thought. But remember, the other is infinity. It cannot be fitted into that your totalizing idea of the other. Hence, the other, even before the encounter, is already thematized and absorbed into the self. That's totalizing. All right? And for Levinas, that's violence. Totalization is violence, doing violence to the other. So this for Levinas is a kind of totalization of the other by the self. But in reality and in truth, such thematization, such totalization, such conceptualization cannot be properly called a relation, because we cannot encounter the other person, or we have not encountered the other person yet. A proper relation, according to Levinas, can only begin with encounter with the face of the other person. And even in that face-to-face encounter, we cannot just attempt to fit that other to our own idea of the other. Otherwise, that's totalization. That's also by doing violence to the other. Now, the epiphany of the face. Levinas then states the moments of the epiphany, the revelation of the face, namely its rectitude or of exposure and defenselessness, its facing, and its demand on the self. Remember, there's an absolute demand on the self. The first moment of the epiphany of the face is uprightness and rectitude, which signifies its exposure, its defenselessness. We cannot, or we do not have control over our face, as we cannot see it. The face is always exposed to the gaze of the other. Hence, the face is naked. It is nude, which suggests its defenselessness before any threat. Levinas writes, the nudity, which is a call to me, an appeal, but also an imperative. I name face. That's the first moment of epiphany of the face. The face appearing as defenseless. The other appearing as exposed to the gaze of other people. The second moment of epiphany of the face lies in the face-to-face encounter. As we encounter the other through the face, the other opens up a new kind of relation. It helps us see the other person as real, as another human being. So, for example, if you are on the street, you are driving your car or you are riding a car, and then you see this poor boy knocks on the window of the car, when you see his face defenseless, asking for help. So now you encounter the other in a face-to-face situation. So that's a real person. That's a real human being. So in the face-to-face encounter, a fellowship and kinship begin to form. A dimension of transcendence starts to open up. For Levinas, the interpersonal relationship does not consist in thinking about the self and the other together, which grounds many ethical theories, but rather to be facing. The true union or true togetherness is thus not a togetherness or synthesis, but a togetherness of face to face. The facing of the other provides the irreducible in ultimate experience of the ethical relation. So when the boy looks at you, look at each other. That's the face-to-face encounter. And that is an experience of ethical relation. What will you do in the boy? How would you respond to the appeal of that face, of that other? So the face-to-face encounter for Levinas is the source and origin of ethics, which is not based on the formulation of universal moral principles. In this sense, ethics comes not as a secondary layer above an abstract reflection on the totality and its dangers, but as an independent and preliminary range. First philosophy is an ethics. The third moment is that the face makes a demand on me. So the boy, face to face, then extends his little hand, asking for food. When a face-to-face encounter, in its nakedness, in its nudity, it makes an appeal. But not just an appeal. It is a command. The face of the other before me does not remain quiet. Yes, the boy may just stare at you. It's very quiet. But it speaks. It looks. It calls. And when it speaks, my being is interrupted by the other. The face looks at me and calls to me. It lays claim to me and asks not to leave it alone. And the proper response to this request, not to be left alone, is to say, here I am. And such response suggests the availability in the readiness of the self to be responsible for the other. So only in the face-to-face encounter with the naked face can we experience the meaning of ethical transcendence. The presence of the face is not one signification among others, but rather the first signification or expression of transcendence. By going beyond being, face immediately breaks up a totality that is created or that has created an unethical situation. You may have this totality in your mind, this comprehension of the other in your mind. But as soon as the naked face appears to you in a face-to-face encounter and makes a call, makes a demand, it breaks the totality in you. This immediacy is brought about by the obsessive proximity of the other that escapes the stage of consciousness. The approach of the other to the face is swift, that consciousness always comes too late for a relation with the other. It is the immediate and excessive proximity of the face that makes possible the disruption of any attempt for totalization. A totalization that renders the face of the other faceless. Now, let's go to the next point, asymmetric relation. For Levinas, the self has the propensity to master, to incorporate everything into itself, to absorb everything into itself, to totalize everything. But in doing this, it commits violence to the other, as it reduces the alterity of the other, the otherness of the other. And for Levinas, this is an unethical situation. The ethical occurs precisely when the other challenges the self and questions it as a being for itself in the face-to-face encounter. Because the self is not just a being for itself. The self is a being for the other. The other to the face causes the self to exit itself, to abandon itself, and puts an end to its propensity for incorporating, for absorbing, for mastering the other into itself, and doing violence to the other. In this sense, the other through the face becomes the path towards transcendence for the self. Hence, for Levinas, true transcendence can only come from exteriority and not from the interiority of a being. True transcendence can only come through the alterity of the other. However, the transcendental movement of the self is not only a movement or act of crossing over, but it is also an ascent. So it is both a crossing over and an ascent. It is transcendent. Trans because it crosses over, and ascent because it rises up. It elevates. So the ethical movement of the self towards the other does not take place in a horizontal or level plane or ground. It involves an upward movement, a crossing over upward. This means that there is a huge gap between the self and other, marked by the discontinuity between the self and the other. Because if the self is here, the other is above. The other occupies a higher ground. And this is what Levinas calls the asymmetrical relation between the self and the other. Asymmetrical, because they don't belong to the same level or ground. This means that there is no balanced position between them, as the other occupies a much higher position than the self. Now, in such asymmetrical relation, the self does not put itself in question, but rather it constantly being questioned by the other. And the self is called to respond. The call and appeal of the other come from an elevation, from a height. Elevation, height. Now, the other's superiority is an expression of his or her absolute transcendence, which excludes the possibility of equivalence between the self and the other, as any possibility of comparison is precluded, despite the absolute ethical proximity of the other, because in a face-to-face situation, there is that possessive proximity between the other and the self. The other, according to Levinas, towers over me, obliging me to responsibility from the dimension of the height. There is, according to Levinas, an insurmountable distance between the self and the other, an irreducible duality, even in love. So this asymmetrical relation between the self and the other constitutes Levinas' account of ethics. There is always a general assumption of equality among human beings. But such ethical assumption is based on the idea that all beings are the same and have the same value and significance. In this sense, the ethical relation between the self and the other can be elevated to a universal law. However, in Levinas, That is not the case because the other occupies a higher position, a higher ground, and therefore it demands from the self from a height. This asymmetrical relation is based on the uniqueness of the other, bears extensive consequences for the ethical practices. Since the relation is non-reciprocal and the self must treat the other in all its uniqueness, there cannot be a moral prescription or a universal law that binds all human beings. In other words, the relation between the self and the other cannot be made universal because it is always grounded on a face-to-face relation or a face-to-face encounter between the self and the other. Therefore, instead of establishing its ethics on the commonalities of all human beings that they share as members of the same species, Levinas establishes its ethics on the uniqueness of the other person. And this uniqueness is not based on the different attributes that this person has or on the fact that the person comes from a different ethnic or religious background. What makes the other is not because of social or personal differences. Rather, the very fact that it is an other. As an other, it is in itself different. It is in itself unique. And therefore, the responsibility for the other must be exercised on a one-to-one basis in the face-to-face encounter without any appeal to reciprocity. So how you deal with a boy, with poor boy knocking at the window of your car, asking for some alms, asking for some food, will be on a case-to-case basis. But it is always an encounter that does not appeal for reciprocity. Meaning, if you help him, you don't expect anything in return. The intersubjective relation is non-symmetrical relation, asymmetrical relation. In the sense, I am responsible for the other without waiting for reciprocity. Were I to die for it, reciprocity is his affair. This is an ethics of infinite, absolute responsibility. Now, last point, otherwise than being. In the course of his analysis, Levinas discovered that the subject, or the self, or the ego, the other, and the transcendence that relates and separates them, no, the other, the transcendence, etc., they do not fit into the framework of phenomenology. Why? Because phenomenology is about entities, about physical objects, about phenomena. But remember that the other and the I, the self, are not phenomena. And transcendence does not have this structure of intentionality we can find in material or physical beings. Through phenomenology, Levinas arrived at another level of thinking. There's a different realization. And he expressed this in his work, Otherwise Than Being. So, Levinas, in this book, gives a new description of the way being is. What is the meaning of being? What is being? So, there's a different, arrive at a new understanding of what is being. He said, esse is interesse. Interesse. Being is an active and transitive interestingness. This interestingness permeates all beings and weaves them together in a network of mutual interest. Ontology, as the study of being or this being, this particular being, this entity, is not able to express the other. Ontology, as the study of this being, cannot express transcendence. It cannot express subjectivity. Why? Because transcendence surpasses being. Transcendence surpasses ontology in the sense. So appealing to Plato, who characterized the good as beyond being, Levinas refers to the concept of transcendence, of infinity, otherness as otherwise, in beyond the realm of being. So these concepts of transcendence, of subjectivity, of otherness, they are beyond being. They are otherwise than being. They're beyond the realm of essences or being. So for Levinas, the other, subjectivity, transcendence, as well as morality, affectivity, death, suffering, freedom, love, history, and many other quasi-phenomena that are resistant to phenomenology and ontology in all kinds of objectification and thematization. As soon as these otherwise than being are treated in a discourse, like discourse in ontology or epistemology, they are converted into a said. They're converted into a said. Said meaning they're converted into a discourse. They're converted into a kind of narrative. And the saying in which the otherwise than being addresses itself to an addressee is lost in the text of the said. So once this otherwise than being are treated in a discourse, they're converted into a said, they're converted into words, then they lost. They're lost in the text of the discourse. However, thematization and objectification are inevitable, especially in philosophy and science. Even in practical dimensions of law, economics, and politics, and even in the organization of justice, cannot do without generalization and groupings of individuals into totalities. So even in this philosophy, we have to rely on the said. Otherwise, we cannot express what Levinas is telling us. So, dethematization. Now, relationship with God, last point. The intersubjective and asymmetric transcendence of the relationship with the other is different from the relationship with God or to God. Otherness, infinity, and beyond do not apply to God in the same way that they apply to the human other. God is neither an object nor a you or a thou. And no human being can meet God directly. However, for Levinas, God has left a trace. The infinite responsibility of the one for the other refers to an election that precedes freedom. That's the trace of God. Responsibility indicates the pre-originary alienity of God, the ill of the Most High, is sharply distinguished from the chaotic anonymity of the Ilya. That is always there. That is not anonymous. The dimension of economy, morality, and justice separates the indeterminacy of being from the beyond all determinacy of God. However, as the practical and theoretical recognition of the relationship between God and humans, religion cannot be separated from ethics. So the only way to venerate God is through devotion to human others. If God has left a trace, that trace is in the face of the other.